All right. I see that people are still entering our space, but it still seems important to start to get going and to welcome students and community to another iteration of A+D Thursdays. If you don't know by now, my name is Shannon Jackson. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Design and Hadidi Professor here in the Arts and Humanities at UC Berkeley. It's a privilege to welcome you again to this series. For those of you who are joining for the first time, I'll tell you that this is a lecture series it sits inside a public course created by my office in order to introduce students to a range of art forms across literature, film, visual art, performance, and design. And in this particular iteration this spring, our focus is on the field of time-based media art. We're able to have that focus thanks to a generous donation from the Kramlich Art Foundation, founded by Cal alum Pamela Kramlich and her husband Dick Kramlich. The foundation is committed to education, research, and public engagement in the field of time-based media art, and all of us every week are grateful for their generosity and the vision of that foundation. We've been able to open the course every week to public and outside, to community members with different visiting speakers. We've had an array of luminaries, including artists and curators such as Isaac Julian, Chrissy Isles, Adrienne Edwards, William Kentridge, and most recently, the day before yesterday, Steve McQueen. Today, however, of course, I have the extraordinary privilege of being able to introduce and welcome the extraordinary artist, Shirin Neshat, a Cal alum, who is known for the formal rigor of her aesthetic as well as for its political acuity. Her video and installation work has appeared all over the world and documents a range of issues, in particular political and social conditions of Iranian and Muslim life, with a particular focus on women and on feminist issues. She was born in Iran and moved to the United States at 17 to study art and earned her MFA here at Berkeley in 1982. Since that time, she has made an extraordinary range of pieces that do, amongst other things, meditate on her experiences of memory and loss before and after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, as well as her placement as a transnational female artist working in the United States and abroad. Many of you may know her Women of Allah series, which introduced the hallmark themes of her pieces, where she examines conditions around male and female relations, public and private dynamics, ideas about religious tolerance, political and secular identities in both Iranian cultures and in Western cultures. Her videos, her installations, her photographs, and more recently, her operas have received incredible international acclaim. For instance, video art pieces like Rapture, which has been given as a gift to all attendees today, as well as a piece like Turbulent, justifiably earned her a Golden Lion Award at the Venice Biennial for the best art piece. But meanwhile, and extraordinarily, she also won the Silver Lion Award for the best film piece with her feature film, Women Without Men. Her work has appeared all over the world, not only, of course, in Venice, but in biennials in Istanbul or Johannesburg, as well as the Art Institute of Chicago, Tate Modern in London, Whitney Museum of American Art, and of course, many of you may know more recently that she enjoyed an exquisite retrospective at the Broad Museum in Los Angeles. I will have to say that her artistic range in her practice, as well as her socio and political themes around difference, around gender, around geographic memory, and around territorial loss could not be more apt for us in our course at Berkeley, and of course also for us as an institution at Berkeley. It is all too apt and appropriate, especially when we consider at Berkeley our own fraught legacies, political legacies that include the fact that our campus is sited on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone tribe. And in reckoning as an institution with our placement in that history, we are also undergoing a necessary process of redefinition. alongside that process, we might take inspiration from Neshat's work and her own delicate processes of investigation, her artistic integrity, as well as her unique capacity to reimagine how people view each other and how they view and inhabit a world together. Helping us situate Neshat's practice in conversation today, I'm also excited to be able to welcome Stuart Comer. Some of you who have tuned in previously have met Stuart before. Stuart is the Lonte Ebers Chief Curator of Media and Performance at MoMA in New York. He oversees the collection and diverse program of exhibitions and events and acquisitions in the Department of Media and Performance. He also leads the Marie-José and Henry Kravis studio. That, if you don't know, is the museum's newest space dedicated to performance, music, sound, and spoken word, and expanded approaches to the moving image. And we all look forward to re-entering that space again soon. He has been a central guide of a range of path-breaking exhibitions in the field, and he will generously serve as a respondent to Shirin's lecture before we open up the Q&A to all of you. You are welcome to respond in the chat and also begin to queue up any questions that you might have for Shirin as well as for Stuart as the event goes, and we'll turn to them in the last portion of the event. But for now, as usual, I hope that you can offer the warmest of welcomes to Shirin in the chat and elsewhere, even if you do so unmuted. And without further ado, I will turn my screen over to the one and only Shirin Neshat. Thank you, Shirin.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pamela Kramlich, for being here, for supporting me over the years and to have my work in your collection. Thank you, Stuart Comer from MoMA, to agreeing to have a conversation with me. I want to make this rather quickly so we can have a very good conversation with Stuart. I've just prepared an overview of my work over the years. It would be more like a visual journey, but I must say that it feels extremely nostalgic to be talking to UC Berkeley audience, especially since I graduated, I studied there, and my graduate and undergraduate studies in art was there from there. And since we're going back in time, I think it's very interesting for me to speak to you, create a little story about how the revolution of my personal life sort of parallels the evolution of my art before I get into the specifics of the work. Again, this is just a story. I don't normally do it, but I feel like this is the right moment. I came to this country in 1975. My father wanted us, his children, to get educated. I accompanied my older sister in 1975. But my sister quickly left back to Iran as she felt quite homesick. So I found myself alone, and I found myself registered at UC Berkeley in 1978. But in 1979 came the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which basically transformed, as all of you know, the Iranian society. So as I arrived in Berkeley with this very romantic idea of a desire to become an artist, etc., that something that had nurtured in me since youth, I immediately faced this incredible issue that came with this brutal revolution, a major separation between me and my family for the next 11 years. The country became isolated from the outside world. In the inside, everything fell apart, and basically the connection with the outside was sort of breaking down. And so at the same time, I, as a young person, by then I was 19 or 20 without any immediate family in the US or even remote family. I had to learn to support myself, but also there was another issue that the diplomatic relationship between US and Iran quickly broke down with this Islamic Republic of Iran, and the American hostages were taken. And the next thing we know, in the US, there was a huge anti-Iranian sentiment. And to make things worse, there was the war with Iraq that finally really brought the walls down to Iran. So I suddenly, at the age of 19, came to this realization that the present, the future of my life was in jeopardy. and that there was no way to go back, but also the future in the US didn't look very good. And this is just an excuse to tell you why I was not a good student. But the truth is that this political reality was the moment, I think, that for the first time in my life as a young woman, I lost the innocence, the good life that I lived, and everything just sort of fell apart without being over dramatic. And I felt pretty destabilized emotionally, psychologically, and politically. And I started to have major anxiety issues. But at school in Berkeley, I was not one of the brightest artists or students, to say the least. But what Berkeley offered me was a safety zone, a sense of community, for a young woman who was sort of a lost soul and deeply in trouble politically. And so for me, what happened in this Berkeley years was this romantic idea of being an artist just sort of went out the window. And I came quickly to understand that I didn't have what it took to be a good artist. And that all the suffering that was happening behind also taught me that I need to survive, first and most. Forget the art, but just survive. And I graduated, and I remember the day I applied to the graduate school at Berkeley. One of my professors, Harold Paris, came out and told all the students, "You got in, you got in." And he looked at me and said, "You barely got in." So it was that bad. But not to say that the school wasn't strong or the teachers weren't great. It's just that I wasn't really able to give to my education what it took from a young person. And maybe that's just an excuse. I came to New York in 1983. At this moment, a more confident woman, but still a lost soul without a real purpose. And I made this clear decision that I wasn't going to be an artist. And I came at the time in New York that was pure bohemia. It's a very exciting time in the 80s. And I just sort of became an observer. I took it in. I met artists. I went to see art, but I was not an artist. And then soon after I came to New York, I met Kyung Park, who became my future husband, who directed a not-for-profit grassroots organization called the Storefront for Art and Architecture. Being a Korean American, a bicultural artist, truly an intellectual, but very political person who was very interested in this connection between art, aesthetic, architecture, and social responsibility. And while I was doing meaningless jobs to earn money, I discovered that the best thing I could do is to join him in running the storefront. So for the next 10 years, I devoted my time running this not-for-profit organization in New York. I became a mother, and art just took a backseat, at least for me. I supported other artists. But something very big happened in 1990. Finally, I was able to return to Iran with my young son. And this was good 11 years after not having been home and not having seen my family. And this trip became a transformative experience for me, not only for the nostalgia that I had and for the reunion, but to be faced with this profound transformation in this country from what I remember during the Shah period, and how it had become a religious state. And I became deeply moved and affected by this. And I started to travel regularly to Iran a few times before I was not able to anymore. By 1993, I became an artist. I think what happened, if the Berkeley years made me come alive as a human being and understand the reality around me and lose the innocence, the romanticism, but not yet have any purpose or any methodology or any concept that could give me the tool to become an artist through the storefront and the encounters with these marvelous artists and thinkers, I finally had found ways where I could become an artist, but what was absent was the concept and the ideas. But by the time I went to Iran and my encounters, I found my way, both conceptually and methodologically. I felt that now I was ready to be an artist. This was about 11 years since I had graduated from school. Now, this came with end of marriage and moving on to a new journey. new collaborators, a new lifestyle. If I was pretty much isolated from the Iranian community up to now, I was now immersed in the Iranian community. Since I went to Iran, I felt the urge and the desire to be reconnected, not only to Iran as a country, but also the Iranian community. It was as if something had been bottled up in me. So as I embarked this journey of becoming an artist, I also entered a whole new phase in my life of an Iranian community, and my future partner became my immediate collaborator, Shoja Azari. Now I want to talk about the work. Enough about my story. The two things one needs to consider in any form of discussion about my work is a discussion about the form and its evolution and its nomadic behavior, from still photography to video installation to cinema and some experiments in opera, and how I have not been trained in any of these mediums, and also how I simultaneously serve multiple audience, not only culturally from Iranian to Western to Middle Eastern, but also people who follow me in the film world or possibly the art world or the opera. So I am simultaneously navigating between different collaborators, but also audience. In terms of content, God knows the work has evolved over the years a lot, but there seem to be some things that remain constant. And I wanted you to think about it as I go review the work. First of all, as I explained to you, that one cannot pull apart my personal life and circumstances, trajectory in life from the evolution of my work. And that although my work is not autobiographical, it stems from urgent issues, questions that I have as a human being that I frame, and I simply raise those questions and look for the answers. And very often I find that the characters of my work in my films, in the videos, mimic who I am. They take my personality, and but also the narratives of my films and my work generally are narratives that I have experienced directly, and that somehow they echo in my work, and also that regardless of what I'm making related to what culture, I'm always an outsider. I'm never able to speak in any form of authority about any given culture. I'm always an outsider to Iranian community as well as the American society, and that's been a part of my vision as an artist. Very quickly, literature, poetry have been an integral part of my work. And it's not like I'm a big reader, but for some reason I've taken interest in poetry and literature, particularly written by Iranian women authors. And this may have something to do with being born to a culture that it's enriched by ancient, modern, contemporary history of literature. And so use of poetry, but also I have readapted novel of Woman Without Men into a feature-length film. Sometimes I use songs like in Turbulent. So literature, words, it's are really integral in my work. And I think that Iranian people seem to rely on the language of literature and poetic and allegorical, metaphoric language as a way to escape censorship or dictatorship in many ways. And for me, that's become a major part of my work. History, although, I never thought I was interested in history. When I look back retrospectively at my work, I realized that I have been, in a very fictionalized manner, a narrator of history. The Islamic Revolution through Women of Allah, the Woman Without Men, 1953 coup, etc., etc. So somehow my work, it seems to frame a particular moments of history of Iran and now United States, which I will speak to later. The sense of paradoxical, the duality, as I spoke to you, that I am not here or there, I'm not quite 100% Iranian, but not quite American. I see everything in the form of opposite, paradoxical, contradictions. And this duality has taken form in my content as well as my form. My work is black and white, very often magic realism, surrealism. I think dreams are a major part of my work. So dreams and reality. In terms of content, very often it's about mysticism, but very political, violent. It's often about men and women, emotional, rational, personal, and global in many ways. And so now I'm going to stop just talking, like just showing you, sharing with you some of my images. I would like to start with a woman of Allah. The very first body of my work started in 1993, and I think Women of Allah ended about 1997 or 1998. The truth is that when it comes to photography, I'm very interested in human portraits that actually is devoid of landscape. I'm very, very sculptural, always black and white. There's no landscape. With the Woman of Allah, I must say that this is the work that followed immediately after I visited Iran. As I told you, I found an obsession with the religious fervor that grew in Iran and transformed a very liberal, sort of somewhat democratic society into a very strictly Islamic state. And I focused on the concept of martyrdom that became so popular, almost institutionalized through the government. So I became very fixated in this concept of martyrdom, and that this obsession of those who were obviously very fanatic, this obsession with faith, love of God, self-sacrifice, yet violence, cruelty, and ultimately an obsession with death. This body of work has gone on to be interpreted and in many different thousands of different ways. But the truth is that I, as a newcomer, as someone who'd been outside of Iran for a number of years, I was just profoundly interested in the sort of this intersection of religiosity and spiritual acts with militaristic violence and behavior, and especially being evident through women who voluntarily became militant during, before and during the revolution. This became a series of self-portraits, and the elements became limited to the female body, which obviously was very controversial and problematic in Islam, any Islamic culture. The weapon that suggested violence, and the veil that obviously for some people is an idea of repression, for others is liberation. And the text, as I said, it was written, poetry written by Iranian women that somehow suggested an idea of a voice and contradicted everything else. This body of work became my entrance to the art world, and I think it puzzled many people, including Iranian people, including the government of Iran, that became very suspicious, that found critical of them, to the people who actually disliked the government and thought that I was endorsing the fundamentalism or the ideology of this government, to the Western critics that thought that I was just sort of embracing, or sensationalizing violence. And so it was highly misunderstood and became very controversial. My interest in photography evolved, and I wanted to talk to you about that. I sort of lost interest in being the subject of my own work and wanted to now make work that sort of became more narrative, more like photographic installations. In 2011, I made a large body of work, and this time it was not anymore about the Islamic Revolution, but about the 2009 Green Movement. As some of you may remember, that was an extremely exciting uprising by the youth in Iran that basically spread all across the Middle East, all over the Arab world. But I was very interested in the difference between this movement that took place in this 2009 as opposed to the Islamic Revolution in 1979, because we were no longer dealing with people that were fanatic. Religion was not an issue, but it was simply by the young people who were patriotic and nationalistic and wanted an idea of democracy. And of course, this was met with brutality, and eventually there was terrible aftermath. And one of the things that I wanted to do by creating this body of work that was really an expansive work of, I think, over 65 work, was sort of to capture this moment of historical moment of euphoria that excited Iranian people. That was the most pivotal moment of Iranian history after the Islamic Revolution, and gave us a glimpse for change. But also it was a reference to the Book of Kings that was from the 10th century. I was referencing literature, as I mentioned earlier, my interest in history, in literature. And this is an epic book, a poem, a mythological book of poem that sort of also focuses on the notion of courage and patriotism, people who were beheaded and killed for their love of their nation. And I found conceptually this really interesting parallel between what I was trying to say about the 2009 Green movements and what Ferdowsi, the author of the Book of Kings, Shahnameh, was trying to depict before the Arab conquest in Iran in the 10th century. So in other words, history tends to repeat itself. In 2013, and I'm jumping a little bit just so because there's a lot to see. As I told you, I became very interested in sort of narrating history, but also sort of by this moment, I was not able to travel anymore to Iran. I won't want to get into the details, but I became blacklisted, and I started to travel to many places that that sort of made me encounter new culture, people, and issues. In 2013, by the invitation, a commission by Rauschenberg Foundation, I went to Egypt, and I made a series called Our House is on Fire. And this, in a way, this body of work sort of took off from where the Book of Kings left, which is the young people that we saw that were either captured or imprisoned or killed. And these were the families of the young people and the price they had to pay, the pain that they had to undergo, and really sort of the aftermath of this euphoric revolutions that were spread from Iran to Tunisia to Egypt, etc. So I went and photographed native Egyptians in Cairo. I interviewed them, and this was a major change in my work, where I no longer was photographing people that I knew, muses or friends or myself, but people that I recruited from the streets, and I invited them to come. Of course, I compensated a slight amount of money, and I would share with them my story, and they would share with me their story. And in this case, they all shed their tears. And the writing is microscopic writings that we wrote on their skin on the photograph. In 2015, now being the nomad, I was invited to go to Azerbaijan to do a project. And for some of you might know, Azerbaijan is on the border of Iran, and used to be a part of Iranian, our country. In fact, my own mother was born in Baku, and she is from Azerbaijan. But so I was invited to go to the border of my country, but not exactly to the country. But what's very interesting about Azerbaijan is that it's a country of multi-ethnicity living all together, from Russians to Armenians to Turks to Persians. Therefore, there's multiple type of looks and religions, ethnicities, and also languages. And I found that fascinating. The project was called The Home of My Eyes. And basically, I recruited people from different backgrounds, and I interviewed them, and the focus of this project was what home means to them, knowing that home was a very problematic issue for me. It was a very, very interesting challenge to be able to really focus in another culture. I want to just mention that by this point, as you can see, my aesthetics are still resembling somewhat the woman of Allah, the use of the hand postures, the simplicity of the pictures with no landscape in the background, very sculptural, and always men and women wearing black. But I became very interested in Christian religious paintings. And as you can see, the hand postures have this position of the prayers, and I was very inspired by El Greco. This work was shown at Venice Biennial at this beautiful museum called Museo Correr, and it was very interesting when I showed it in this space. They were very apologetic because there was actually a Madonna in the room that they could not move, and this couldn't have been more magical because all of my characters, the subjects, were also in that praying position. So it was really sort of creating this very interesting kind of mood of a chapel. Now I'm going to the videos. I want to explain to you this move from the still photography to the moving picture. First of all, after the Woman of Allah and the experience of the way that the work was so politically pointed, that it really would not allow many people to escape their judgment and sort of forget about their, opinions about the Islam or this government. Everything was decided according to their relationship to that subject. And I felt sort of exhausted by that kind of judgment. And so unconsciously moving toward the moving picture and becoming more of a storyteller as opposed to making this highly potent images, it was sort of an unconscious decision to sort of navigate away from directly political work and to make work that are more poetic, more lyrical, more ephemeral, and that it doesn't, even though it makes references to reality, it doesn't really land on reality. But came with the videos also collaboration with my team, a new team that I told you after the storefront I met, and also incorporating music, choreography, performance. It just sort of opened a whole new horizon for me, and I fell in love with the moving picture. And I think this was in 1998 and that I made Turbulent, and it was a very pivotal work for me, and it was also a work that that really taught me a great lesson about making work that was still pointing towards some socio-political issues. It could be truly transcend all of that and become very universal, and that anyone could relate to those work and identify with the subjects. And also to say that these videos, both Rapture here in 1999 and Turbulent, were created as two opposite projections. So I was able to not physically engage in a very sculptural manner where the audience will become literally a participant in the work. We are about to see this work of Rapture, but I just wanted to say, as I mentioned earlier, just the notion of duality, the black and white, men and women, nature and the fortress as a very masculine space are integral part of these two work. And the last thing I want to say, it's a great honor that Rapture is in the collection of the Kramlich Foundation. Thank you, Pamela. And I just would say, let's take 3 minutes and watch the video clip, and then I'll be back with more. I wanted to talk about a rapture, just to mention a couple of things. One, that I truly consider this piece like a dance choreography. And I really enjoyed the idea that the story was unraveling from one group versus the other. There was no individual protagonist, and that their interaction in nature, the woman from the desert to the sea, their migration, and the men in this architecture of the fortress was very symbolic. The other thing is the feminist in me, just like in Turbulent, where the woman sings in an empty theater and the man with the full theater. And ultimately she becomes victorious because her music breaks all the rules of traditional music, becomes guttural, and while he becomes the conformist. Equally in Rapture, I felt there was that duality where the men stayed within the parameter that they're most familiar with, which is the fortress, where the women were the courageous ones that symbolically, that they did go toward the sea, and eventually a few got on the boat and left. And whether that was an idea of suicide or escape, we don't know, but we know that it was a great courage to take their own destiny in their own hand. And so this was a theme or something that repeats in my work that I think is very important, is a woman's point of view, obviously. I wanted to go next to talk about Roja. This is a piece that I wanted to mention before going to the latest work, because my interaction with cinema and introduction to the language of cinema and the idea of developing a story that had a beginning, middle, and the end, it influenced my own video arts in the way that Roja became a character for the first time. It was no longer about groups or that the people in videos became just more like sculptural. Here we really had a character that was psychologically followed. And in the case of Roja, I think that also for the first time, I began to take myself away from the story, like, or self-portraits, but now the woman who played the roles became my own extension, and they began to look like me, or at least there were certain looks that I was after. So Roja is really truly this conversion between my interest in cinema and my own early black and white work, but also Roja was the first time that I truly delved into making work about dreams, because Roja was a part of a trilogy called Dreamers, which was Illusions and Mirrors and Sarah and Roja, which was made in 2016. And so for me, the aspect of dream that became very, very interesting was that dreams are innocent, and you could do anything, but you're not guilty. But also in dreams, we we can reference reality. We see people that we have seen, places that we have been, but nothing quite makes sense. And Roja was actually based on one of my own dreams. And I became very conscious of the importance of dreams and how in our dreams are when we are completely naked and truthful, and it's there that we face our deepest anxieties and fears and dilemmas, and that is an issue for me that has been very interesting. These are some of the images of video of Roja, and the mother figure that my own mother appears constantly in my own dreams. Finally, I want to spend some time with the latest work, Land of Dreams. First of all, this is the first time, I mean, I've always done photography, video, and film, but sort of kept them aside as very different work and languages and audiences. And I've made 2 feature-length films, but nothing to do with the artwork. But I thought for the first time it would be interesting to come up with a project that could simultaneously collapse into 3 mediums: photography, video, and a movie. So in 2019, I started a photographic project, and essentially the Land of Dreams became a story of an Iranian woman photographer who actually I bring her picture, so here it is, which really looks like Roja, and again a certain look, a small petite with big eyes, not so much makeup like me, but it really became my story as an immigrant in the United States. I have lived here longer than in my own country, but I've never made work about this country. But I think during the Trump era was that I realized the importance and the urge of really now turning my lens toward America. Again, from an outsider's point of view, an immigrant's point of view. So we went to New Mexico as a group of Iranians, and I did what in the video and in the movie the protagonist does. We went door to door, or we recruited people in New Mexico, which, by the way, its landscape of the Southwest is tremendously beautiful, but very much similar to Iran. But also the demographic was very interesting for me. There's a large Native Indian population, to Hispanic, to African American, and Anglo. So I was able to visit many people and sort of interview them. And the main question here was, can you tell me about your last dream? And so we gathered people together in pizza parlors in Albuquerque, to hotels in Las Vegas, New Mexico, to Farmington, where the natives live. And basically, we took over 200 pictures of different faces and personalities, and the writings and the illustrations in the backgrounds are interpretation of these individuals' dreams, and also the name and the place they were born and the year. And what I wanted to mention was that I forgot something very important, is that the important part of this installation for me was that this was a portrait of America from the perspective of an immigrant. Just like the group, The Home of My Eyes or Our House is on Fire, which sort of represented a nation, at least from my perspective, this was the way America looked like to me: the diversity of the faces, the ethnicities, the ages, the gender, etc. I think I'm running out of time soon, so I'm going to go. These are some of the images from Land of Dreams. As you can see, there were numbers. This is Simin, the main protagonist in the video, that travels daily from this very obscure Iranian colony to a small town. Julia, maybe we just skip the video, I don't know. But these are some of the images from the video that basically is the journey of a woman that works within this bureaucratic environment that actually looks more like a nuclear plant, that they should be making bombs, and is full of Iranian men and women in lab coats. But what they really are doing is they are sort of analyzing American people's dreams. And this protagonist goes on daily basis to people's homes in America, collects their photographs and dreams, and brings them back. I want to.
If I could just interject, I do want to say that if you do want to show a clip from this, I think our community would really appreciate getting to see it. So please don't feel rushed.
Okay, so I think that this would be wonderful to do that, and then I come back. So I will just stop right here. We look at 3 minutes.
Thank you. So you're in the army?
Yeah, I was there.
For how long?
Too long, way more than I care to remember.
Some really amazing photographs.
Yes, I was there for that one.
Actually, do you mind if I just ask you one more favor?
I guess so.
Would you tell me your last dream?
My last dream. You know, it's always the same dream. Same place, same time. No, it isn't a dream. It's a nightmare. There's this whitish blue light that shoots across the sky, you see. Black smoke rises to form a cloud that covers the sun. I can now look at the sun directly with naked eyes from behind the black smoke. I hear people screaming. The sun is gonna fall. The sun is gonna fall. A strong wind sweeps across the land. The air is full of dust and flying objects. And then there's silence. Dead silence. The sun has died behind the deep black cloud as it starts to rain. Black rain. Raindrops of oil and...
Thank you. Just wanted to touch on a couple of things about Land of Dreams. Is that it was one of the first time that I introduced language to the videos, but there were all the dualities that I spoke about earlier. It exists here, Iran, the United States, dream, reality, the individual plight of this lady and the communities that she goes into, the industrial interior claustrophobic space versus this beautiful, magnificent, natural landscape, and black and white. And also that I wanted to say that for me, there's something very particular about the relationship or the ambiguity of a relationship between dreams and photography, because photography is about freezing a moment, the permanency, capturing something and keeping it forever. But dreams are so ephemeral and so impermanent, and they vanish so quickly. So there was something very beautiful and profound about this relationship between her taking people's pictures and then collecting their dreams. Now we are just in the last legs of post-production for the feature-length film of Land of Dreams, a 2-hour movie. The same lady, Sheila Van, the fantastic actress, plays the role. We have here a fully written script by Jean-Claude Carrier, who actually unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago. He was 89. He works with Louis Bonneval, well known for his surrealist scripts. And basically we have a professional cast of Matt Dillon to Isabella Rossellini, to Anna Gunn, Christopher McDonald. But essentially the story also evolves around the story of an Iranian woman in the middle of Southwest, going door to door to collect people's dreams. But this time she works for the American Census Bureau. There's a lot of humor. There's a political satire, I would say. We are really, I would say this is also quite surrealistic, but it is much more conventional narrative than the video. These are some of the additional shots. I really want to speak with Stuart, so I'm sorry I'm taking too long. These are some of the shots at the very end of the film where she lays out hundreds and hundreds of photographs that she has done, which by the way, I photographed those pictures. And just very briefly, I won't even go into, yes, I've made other films, Woman Without Men, a feature film that was a readaptation of a novel by Shahnusha Parsipour. The film was shot and was released in 2009. Another feminist film about 4 female protagonists during the 1953 coup in Iran. These are some of the characters in the film. Looking for Kulthum, the film that came out in 2017, a very ambitious period film about the iconic Egyptian singer Kulthum, who was the biggest artist of the 20th century in the Arab world, in the Middle East. I don't know what gave me the courage as a non-Egyptian to make a film about an Egyptian singer that no Egyptian or Arabic person has dared to do. But it was from an Iranian artist, filmmaker, trying to make a film about Kulthum. So again, it was a very personal story. And last and not least, I have Pamela is the only one among you that has seen this opera that I directed at Salzburg Festival. I really was shocked when they invited me, but it was a very much of a minimal event, like a sculpture. Well, actually it was not a minimal event. There was like over 300 cast, a very extraordinary opera, but I won't go into just to detail, but these are some of the images. Just wanted to share with, this is a very bad resolution, but the AIDA is coming back in 2022, and I'm integrating some of my past videos in the work. Stuart, I'm done. I'm happy to speak with you. Sorry I took too long.
You did not take too long. It's an extraordinary body of work, and it takes time, as we note, to share time-based art. So Shirin, that was absolutely extraordinary. And I'll welcome Stuart Comer to engage in a bit of dialogue before opening up to the group.
Thank you, Shannon, and thanks again for the invitation. I had a little bit of a catch up with Shirin yesterday, and we've not really had the opportunity to work together directly, although I've been involved with collections that hold her work, and it's really a huge pleasure to be able to be in conversation. So thanks to all of you, and again, thanks to the Cramlet Art Foundation too. I saw Rapture there installed a few years ago in Napa, and I hadn't seen it in several years, and it really stopped me in my tracks again. So I wanted to start, well, for one thing, Shirin, we were talking yesterday, we share a very close mutual friend named Nagar Azimi, who is the editor of a magazine called Bidoon. And I just wanted to talk about that word Bidoon for a second, because it's actually an Arabic word that means without. And in a sense, your work has sort of become about a state of being without geography, or from a specific place, and sometimes the work is rooted in that specific place, Iran, but it's an imaginary as well. And so you're sort of from everywhere and nowhere at once in the work. And then I also wanted to kind of come back to your reference to Kyung Park and your engagement with him at that point in your life. And moving from this still image, from photography into architecture, really, because, you know, the work was spatial. And as you said, it was participatory. And you're part of a generation of artists and video artists in particular who were moving the situation into one of a spatial encounter beyond just a conventional flat surface or a two-dimensional image, but one that was multidimensional. And I feel like the space of the nomad and the space of encounter and video installation have a lot in common. And I just wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I know it's an abstract question, but just maybe to get things going.
I think it's an excellent point, Stuart, and I often think that the situation that I'm in is kind of a mixed blessing, because on the one hand, I could never be considered entirely an Iranian artist with any form of authority, because I haven't even been there since 1996. And my work would never be able to represent that culture in any absolute way. But also, I'm not really entirely Western, I'm not really American, and I could never represent this culture. And therefore, I think this is very interesting, because I would say my work is sort of an accented work, because in the one hand, my education is Western, my art historical background is very Eurocentric, but then if you look at my work, its visual vocabulary, aesthetic is very Persian, Islamic, really an elaboration of classic Islamic art, the idea of repetition, composition that is, you know, is abstraction, is the sense of geometry, even in Rapture, for example. So there's this hybrid of influences that appears even by how I look, you know, like, for example, the way I do my makeup, but then I'm wearing very Western clothes, the way I live, my community. So just like what you were talking about, Bidun, I think that is the epitome of a reality of people like myself that have absolutely no longer the right to say, I belong to this or that. And they will never be able to make work that has that sense of absoluteness. And that there is something very comforting in that, because you can transcend and cross borders, but you know, it has its own problematics. Often I think that my work gets terribly misunderstood in the West, and terribly misunderstood by Iranian people, for example. Its intentions, its abstraction, its conceptual strategies don't resonate for some of the Iranian people, but also some of the political, the more poetic, the sort of, you know, the aspects of my work that are coming from Iranian roots don't resonate with the Western critics. So there's also that, but it's just about negotiation.
And I was thinking, I mean, this is a tiny bit of a tangent, but I wanted to bring up a film that you did not make, in fact, but it made me think about your relationship to the photographs of the, you know, of 1979, of the situation of Iran at that time. And a close friend of mine, Matt Wolf, is a filmmaker who made a film about a woman named Marion Stokes, who was a Black woman in Philadelphia, who had a public access television show in the 70s. And then it was literally the Iran hostage crisis that effectively sort of jump-started CNN. You know, 24 hours news became what it became, you know, really in that moment around 1980. And when you start to think about the flood of images we in this country received and how it determined our image of Iran and the amount of sort of toxic racism it produced in that moment. And, you know, Rapture was made 20 years later, but I think it was a work that reset the visual vocabulary, certainly in this country, that we had for Iran, or even just, again, the sort of imaginary that you were constructing. And so while so much video art is about appropriating media images and remixing them, you know, you were not actually doing that. You were creating your own kind of lexicon, your own visual lexicon for a different way of thinking about that culture and how it might relate to the West or to, you know, to even the United States. And I just wonder, you know, how you responded to that kind of barrage of media images that created so much negativity towards the culture you were coming from in a moment that you were adjusting to being in this country.
So glad you brought that up. I think one of the dilemma that a lot of us Iranians have, and I have, is that our very identity is conflicted between our history as Persians and what it comes with that wealth of, mysticism and knowledge and very well. And then this reality since the Islamic Republic of Iran, the idea of fanaticism, violence, and sort of very barbaric behavior that is sort of captured the mind of a lot of Westerners, that somehow they forget what Iran was before the revolution. In fact, when I made Women Without Men was a period film about 1953. It was really refreshing to be able to capture a moment of Iranian history before the revolution and what we look like and what we, what our lives were like. And so I think that in my work, in every photograph, every video, everything I do, that sort of duality between the Persian versus the Islamic conflict, contradiction, it exists. In the one hand, you have poetry and emotions and songs and turbulence, and then you have knives and you have weapon, and then you have the veil, you have the revolutions, you have brutality, you have blood. So this identity conflict of Iranian people is inherent in my work in every possible way. And I'm always sort of navigating. I mean, the fact that I haven't been able to even see my family in Iran. And so there's a lot of things that are really, I think for me on daily basis, I'm dealing with political realities related to my own country, but also I'm very much following what is happening in Iranian culture, the latest books and music and what is happening inside and outside. So for example, Rapture is this very lyrical, this is kind of it's a poetry. It's really, to me, some of my work tends to be very poetic. And then there's some work that are very angry and very political. And then sadly, I also have to deal with something else, which is dealing with the media and the interpretation of my work. And while I absolutely detest the Islamic Republic of Iran, I also find myself defending my culture and sort of standing up for it. So it's a very complex situation to be in.
Absolutely. I'm also just thinking a little bit about landscape in the work. And I mean, Rapture was actually, I believe, shot in Morocco, if I'm not mistaken. But,
Yes.
And I mean, in the newer work shot in New Mexico, I mean, New Mexico itself is such a loaded landscape. Like on the one hand, it's an indigenous landscape, it's a Latinx landscape, but it's also a feminist landscape. And you think about Georgia O'Keeffe or Agnes Martin or the sort of, American artists who really defined it in some ways, as well as land art. And, it has such a strong connection to so many different chapters of art history. And so I think, what this newer project does in terms of, again, to some extent linking to the earlier work too, but how you move across the landscape, I think is such a crucial part of your entire body of work. And how has that thinking kind of shifted from, again, maybe what you were claiming in the late 90s versus what you're trying to engage with in a very precarious moment in this country?
What Storefront taught me a lot was about space, built space and natural space, and its significance. And it's very interesting because when I look back, Stuart, in my work, even Turbulence, the theater, and then Rapture, the fortress versus the natural landscape, Roja, that magnificent egg building behind her, with Land of Dreams, that magnificent cliff, the mountain behind her, and then versus the power plant where we shot supposedly the Iranian colony, where it's supposed to be a nuclear plant facility, but they're dissecting people's dreams. To me, these are very decisive, decisions on my part, like what spaces am I in Women Without Men. It's absolutely like we had the orchard as a place where the woman escaped to, and then we had the city of Tehran that really pointed toward history, realism. So when magic took place in the orchard and the garden, but then reality took place in the city. So I have been, somehow unconsciously really keen on using architecture, different type of architecture of representing cultures, but also spaces, whether it's sexual, political, but also natural landscape as a form of escape. Gardens, I've used a lot of gardens, but also deserts.
And I guess, I mean, speaking of sort of feminist landscapes and just feminist work in general, I wonder just if you could talk a little more deeply about, you know, what it means to be a woman, to be an artist, to be still negotiating the aftermath of governmental repression and action. And, I don't think of you as an activist per se, but I'm thinking of you as sort of in a dialogue with somebody like Tanya Bruguera or Coco Fusco, who are actively engaging the Cuban government right now in their work. And while your work did not directly address the government in Iran specifically, I think it's still a negotiation in your mind and in your soul and in the work. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that without a doubt, even when I say work is surrealistic, poetic, magic realist, or dream, it's a social critique, and it's not really just about my point of view, but it's framing certain questions that I think are really very important. And I think that with the work that I did with Women of Allah in relation to Iran, just with framing the question of martyrdom and raising this issue of this extreme contradiction and the hypocrisy of that, by framing that question, that was a critique, and I think the government probably noticed that. But I think that with the Land of Dreams, the knife is still sharp, but it's different, because I'm saying that dreams are common human experiences, shared human experiences. Our nightmares are very similar, whether we're sitting in New Mexico, in Iran, in South Africa, or in South America, that our dreams about, violence, abandonment, displacement, death, these dreams don't know borders, like geography doesn't know borders. So I think the essence of Land of Dreams and this obsession with collecting people's dreams, we realize that this woman, this protagonist, is supposed to be me, realize that actually the nightmare that Native American has in New Mexico, it's not that different than of my own. That sense of lack of security, that you're not home in your own land, or the feeling of displacement, the anxiety about the future, or the man that worried about the nuclear holocaust, and that the clip that we saw, the violence, the issue of annihilation, of death, and a lot of these. So for me, that the Land of Dreams is really, while it becomes about a kind of a social critique about America, is about our humanity. It's about what we have in common as opposed to what we are different about us. And that is our dream. And I think that's a very powerful way of talking about politics. We don't have to be talking directly. And by me bringing the faces of the natives and putting it next to the African American, and then, the Hispanic, the white, and the poor, the rich, the functional, the dysfunctional, that's a statement. It's saying, this is a portrait of America, and the America that I know and that I cherished. And anything other than that, it's a different America that I came to. And that's a problem. So I think the approaches of artists as activists or critiques are different. And I've learned over the years that I like to be much more indirect.
Yes. So that's an interesting point too, because I wondered how you think of yourself in terms of, your role as a translator, or the work as a form of translation of many cultures into a very lucid image or idea. And I noticed even in the chat, a number of people talked about, the voice in your work, but oftentimes the work is actually beyond language, or it doesn't necessarily include language, but sound is critical. Like, sound is essential to the success of the work. But I'm wondering, how you see your role, or the work's role, in terms of translation, between cultures, and how you can, bring very complex ideas into such a crystalline form.
I think the core goal of me as an artist is to provoke emotions, whether that comes from a gaze of a photograph, that the person who's looking at the audience, like this collection of 110 photographs looking at you, creating this emotions in you, that you're being observed, that you're not just observing them, that you are being observed, or whether it's through this sweeping music, through landscape, whether it's going after this magnificent architecture of the mountain, let's say in the Southwest, and then opposite going to this laboratory, is to really provoke certain emotions in people that it reaches them in a way that the narrative sort of transcends above all of the specificities of cultures, if I could say, and reaches a more profound place, you know. And I think that's a very difficult thing to achieve. But for me, seeing a work of art is like a religious experience. I want to be moved, and I want to move people by the way I tell the story, the way I use the camera, the way I do the production design, the way I use the sound, the way I write calligraphy on the photographs. I want to seduce my audience by the darkness, the melancholy, but the beauty. And that's another thing. We're talking about paradox. There's a lot of pain, darkness in my work, a lot of suffering, like I said, I went through. But there's also a lot of joy and a lot of beauty, and there's a lot of aesthetic. And that is something that I find directly tied to the idea of mysticism, that where I come from. The idea of melancholy is not depression, it's profound and it's beautiful. And I think at the end, I feel like I'm functioning like a poet, that I want to move people in a very mystical way. And I use everything, every tool I have in my hand to make it work. And sometimes I fail, sometimes I don't achieve that, but that's my goal.
Thank you for that. And as we move into questions from the audience now, because I know we're running out of time, but maybe just one final question. If you could talk a little, you know, we're in a moment, certainly coming out of the pandemic, hopefully coming out of the pandemic, where, you know, the ways in which violence against women, anti-Black violence, anti-Asian violence, you know, the shocking and horrific clarity with which it is being revealed, you know, how these things work in our society. I'm just wondering how your work now, including the earlier work, might, you know, address that condition, because, you know, you were addressing aspects of these questions early on too, but as you said, things have changed. And I'm just wondering how you see the work shifting in response to those conditions. And then we should definitely open it up to the audience.
Another wonderful question. Thank you for asking me that. I mean, being born Iranian and being somewhat naturally political, I've always found myself in a position of feeling responsible in the way I communicate and to my multiple audience. And that even involuntarily, I found myself as a speaker to many Iranian people, etc. I think more than ever, artists, arts, the art world needs to feel a new form of responsibility according to the time that we live in. And I think we have gone through a very, very dark time, but I think we could be better for it because we have seen the absolute worst. And what's beautiful about it, that is global. It's, you know, we have a shared pain that we have experienced. And I think we no longer can exist in a bubble. And I think one of the reasons, Stuart, we didn't get to talk about very much is at this entrance to the cinema, and the fact that also I would like to reach the mainstream and to be able to make films that further communicate ideas about the social environment and how I feel like I can participate in this conversation as an artist to a larger community. But I feel very much that I would like to be a part of a community that is vocal. It takes responsibility, but not necessarily making propaganda, but truly a work of art. And thank you for asking that.
Fantastic. So I will hand it back over to Shannon and the moderator.
Thank you so much to the two of you. This whole disquisition around the relationship between aesthetics and politics resonates so deeply with everything we've been discussing throughout the semester, especially about what you talked about, all of the tools that you use, Shirin, in terms of mobilizing all different kinds of affects and emotions, joy and melancholy, and also the importance of abstraction sometimes, or the indirect way that the arts engage, and that we need everything. So really so exquisite. And I think a lot of the questions that are brewing in the chat will expand even further some of the thoughts that you've already got to share. I'm going to invite the two graduate students who help with teaching our course, Casey and Edgar, if you can join the grid. They've been also monitoring the chat and the Q&A. Casey is getting her PhD in film and media, and Anna is a deft analyst of work like yours. And Edgar is pursuing his MFA in the program where you earned your degree, Shirin. So lovely to have them always helping all of us. Maybe just, I also want to invite, just to get some other voices here. There's voices of students and community and real experts in the field all attending here. And I wonder, maybe Kelly Tan, would you be willing to unmute yourself to ask? You have two incredible questions brewing here. I wonder if you'd be willing to unmute and ask them yourself.
Yeah, so I typed the two questions in the chat. The first one was, you were mentioning that you're talking a lot about home and how you're not feeling quite Iranian, but you're not also feeling quite like part of the US. And I was just wondering, like, what do you define as home and how has that changed over time?
Can you, just on the heels of that, could you ask that second one too? I think it relates as well.
Oh, yeah, okay. So you were also mentioning how like your work is always misunderstood by both countries. And I was just wondering, how do you deal with that? And how would you suggest us as students or like artists to make sure that your work isn't misunderstood?
Okay. First of all, I answer the second question first because I think once the artist is created, the work is out of their control, and any person is entitled to their interpretation, and it's fine with me. It may not be the interpretation that I agree with, but that is their right, and you cannot control people's point of view. You know, about the question of home, it's really hard to explain. I was telling you about from Berkeley years how this deep anxiety started in me, is feeling quite unstable and just very vulnerable. And to this day, as I sit here, that anxiety exists in me. It's never left me. I'm always not quite comfortable. I never can say somewhere is totally my home. And of course, I have a son, I have a home here in New York, my partner, but this idea of the constant change and readaptation from one culture, one place to another, has been a way of life, let's put it this way. And there's a pluses and minuses to that. I have learned to live with that idea that you're just a nomad and you just keep moving. I'm thinking of our friend Negar as in me. I know multiple people who just have different identities in different places. You know, like they become someone else. Like if they're within the Iranian community, the Western, if I go to New Mexico, if I'm in Egypt, I'm a different person. So there is a part of us that becomes dormant, another part becomes active. And this is something you won't get to have if you live in the same place the whole life, you know, like if I lived in Iran, you know. So there is something about it, that adventurous part about it, that I enjoy, and the fact that I don't know who I'm going to encounter. But there's this underlying anxiety under my skin every single day that I don't like, but I think it will be with me. And my partner now says, that's the only reason I'm an artist, because I have all that anxiety. If they take it away, I won't be that. But that's just been the way of life, coping and learning to adapt to everything.
Thanks so much. And about what it means to turn the fact that you feel that you don't belong, or to turn anxiety into an aesthetic form. Casey and Edgar, do you want to assemble a couple of questions or point out a few that are brewing?
Yeah, definitely. There's so many great questions here. But Shirin, you have one from Ghazal about your very early work, about the work you made before your breakout with Women of Allah. And I know we have a lot of students here today, so I wonder if you could speak maybe about some of the work you did in your MFA program, or some of the really early works you made when you were sort of still finding your creative identity.
I hope the chancellor is not listening, because I destroyed every single work I ever created at school. I even destroyed the slides. I just can't be honest enough with you. I was really a bad artist. I was like a painter.
Hey,
Yeah, I have to say, but my process, you see, I remember artists that were studying at the time, and they were fantastic even then. I was just sort of mixing the Persian iconography with Western. I mean, it was just bad. And I moved to New York. I think soon after I met Kyung Park Stuart. He said, "Oh my God, you better hide those." And I just like quickly destroyed them. So I have no evidence to show you, other than to say they were completely mediocre. But it was part of my process, and I was just smart enough to know that I should not jump on the ladder and just get off. And I have nothing to show you, and nothing to talk about previous to the Woman of Allah. I literally don't have anything.
Except the memories of the process.
Significant, yes.
Yeah, right. It's all a journey. Edgar, do you want to share some thoughts from the
Yeah, definitely. I, first wanted to say that as an artist and as someone who also exists within multiple spaces, I really appreciate you sharing about the possibilities, the excitement, and also about the anxiety, as you mentioned, in that like movement that anxiety can produce. And you just shared about, not showing certain work. And I wanted to share the question of Remy, who's writing us from Chelsea, London, who asks us, if you ever like censor or regulate yourself in your work, if you ever edit something out, if you can give us an example of something you feel like you've edited out, since you've kind of brought that up a little bit.
Yeah, I have to say to young artists that sometimes we're not the best editors of our own work. And I think sometimes it takes time for the artists themselves to be able to really have a command on whether this was good or not. There have been work that I have, especially some photographs that I put out that I would like to reclaim and throw out, but it's too late. Usually I've learned my lesson, and with the videos, like the Land of Dreams is only, I think, 28 minutes, the composite version. We took about a year and a half, to the whole process would take forever. But still, I think that they're imperfect. I mean, there's a difference between imperfection, which is a part of any work of art, in my opinion. I don't think I've ever done anything that is not flawed, but there are some work that are worse than the others. But would I take them away completely? No, because I think the idea of failure or imperfection is also a fundamental part of the artistic practice. There are always people saying, "Oh, I like her first work, Turbulent, the best. Oh, I like Rapture. I don't like the latest work." But or something like that. But I have to see this work like my children. And as I'm growing old and as I change, as my life changes, the work changes. And I can't say, "Oh, I liked me better when I was 30 years old and I hate myself now." It is what it is. But at the same time, I think that we do need to be careful about editing our work. And I have a number of people, for example, the film that I'm just editing, I told Stuart, I sent it to my friend Negar, a few close friends, to get their feedback, because at some point I don't think I have the right perspective. So I'm very conscious of that.
Casey, do you want to offer another question? Or I guess.
We have a question from Adam about collaboration, since many of your works, especially these later feature films, entail a lot of other creative voices supporting your vision. So if you could speak a little bit about how you collaborate.
Yes. I've always collaborated. Even when I took the first photographs of Woman of Allah, I didn't own a camera, so I performed for my friend, and so collaboration has been a fundamental part of my practice. I don't even know how to do it otherwise. But I think with the film-based work, I really had to gather people who had the expertise, from the scriptwriter to the cinematographer to the producers to the production designer to sound and composers, and I've had to learn my way. To this day, I am usually the leader of the group, and it's tough because they have much more experience than I do. But I go intuitively, I listen to their opinion, and ultimately I take what I like and I get rid of what I don't like. In fact, after this conversation, we go with the editor and my colleagues to talk about the latest edit, and I'm already gearing up to be fighting for what I like. So my idea is, work with people, respect them for what they bring, but do not take what you don't believe in. And that's hard because it hurts people's feelings, but I've learned to do that diplomatically. And I also, film work basically is a teamwork. So it's just, there's no other way around it. And I enjoy that part very much.
Wonderful, thank you. And thinking about what it is to sort of mobilize different types of creative teams for different kinds of projects, we have a question from Averitt Coleman that also really relates to something that we've been thinking about quite a bit, and it came up actually on Tuesday when we hosted Steve McQueen, which is what it means for you to travel between, say, an art world where you're doing video installations and the world of feature films. You might also even talk about opera. Averitt is asking if you could speak more about how you compare video artworks to your feature films. The spatial dynamics of rapture between the two screen positions, it's central, literally, it's in the middle. Do you feel feature films have a key quality to reach a broader audience that's important to be outside of a museum or gallery space? Or is it partly related to production budgets or financing more complex works? Do you think about those issues when you think about what mode of artwork you're making?
Well, people think that I'm very ambitious to do all of these things, but truly I like the challenges that that each different type of language brings me. At the moment, the revision of Aida, talking to a dramaturgist and the stage designer and the festival director, and talking about the new conductor and the soprano singer. And at first I get very frightened, but then when I'm talking to them and we're developing ideas, it seems so invigorating and so creative, and I feel so excited because I feel like a beginner. I feel like, look, I don't want to make a career out of being an opera director, so if it doesn't go well, who cares? At least I am doing something that really excites me. Like when I first came to photography, I didn't know what I was doing. I was playing. And I think same comes with the movie. I am so enthralled by the idea that I, as a visual artist, can bring my language, as what I've developed over the years, into the cinematic language, into a script that is comprehensive, it has development, that is not confusing, it's not just an extended art installation, it's symbolic, it resonates similar ideas, but to a very diverse audience. Well, these are very challenging, and I think very often I struggle because it's not easy, and it takes so many years. Every film takes 6 years or a little bit less. So I think it's excruciating sometimes, this idea of to be in my shoe. But the only thing that keeps me going is always being on the edge of failing, and then forgetting my name in the art world. Maybe people forget me, they don't buy my work, they don't see it, they don't write, it's like if you do too much of so there's always risk involved, but there's something unstoppable once you're addicted to doing the different things.
Fabulous, and that's a type of lesson, and about not being afraid of failure, that seems important for everyone, all of us, to hear. Edgar, do you think you could close us out with a last question?
Yeah, I'm actually gonna look. I see a question here from Megan, who's asking a question here. One saying this is a wonderful talk, and also wanting to ask a question about the differences between installation works and for screen films, and is also wanting to know if Stuart could say a little bit about that as well, from the perspective of spatial thinking and designing the experience of film works.
Yeah, we're thinking a lot about the spatial experience of the screen throughout.
So you start.
Again, I would also not only address the screen, but the sound space. And this is something I think Shirin and Steve McQueen really share as pioneers, that they really understood that the acoustic potential of these situations is as powerful as the visual, and it took it to another level. So that's part of it. And, there's a long history of expanded cinema work, and particularly in the UK, they talked about the politics of the room and, situating the spectator not as a passive observer, but someone deeply engaged, in this visual environment. And I think Shirin has absolutely evolved that notion in beautiful ways.
Well, what I could mention is that there are certain aspects of video art that is much more free because it allows far more enigma. The abstraction is allowed in the art world. You don't have to comprehend everything, which is really wonderful, really wonderful, and it gives the artist great freedom. In the film, you're constantly dealing with the need for comprehension, accessibility, even if you are making some far out independent films and the producers are on your case about this is too long, the pacing is too slow, or the ideas are not coming across. So I would say that there's certain restrictions in the film world that is not as free, but at the same time, telling a full story as opposed to a poem is also really satisfying, to be able to develop and unravel a story over 2 hours. I mean, someone like Steve McQueen has become a master director. You know, he's incredibly gifted as a director in you know, both in video art and in his movies that are quite conventional, actually. I think my challenge is that my film-based work is still not so conventional. They still have a footing in the art world. So it's different. Stuart and I were talking about yesterday that how different artists who have been making movies are flirting with cinema in different degrees. Julian Schnabel goes 100%, or maybe Steve McQueen with 12 Years a Slave. But then Matthew Barney or myself, like I go 50%, Matthew Barney got 5%. You know, so we all are seduced by cinema and in a different degree. And also the commercial, the form of entertainment, whether, you know, and so we're dealing with very different parameters.
Since this is a public lecture series inside of a course that is meant to help all of us think about different art forms and relationships amongst different art forms, including performance, including cinema, including visual art, this last pass that you offered, Shirin and Stuart, just was tailor-made for everything we're doing in terms of thinking about how different aesthetic forms do different kinds of work. Absolutely incredible. And also, I'll just tell you that even your own analogy today between analogizing video art to a poem and the feature film to a story, Steve McQueen uses a similar analogy, calling one poetry and the other a novel. And it's, you know, different deployments of similar tools. Most importantly, I'm so, as usual, grateful to have this incredible gathering, to have you, Shirin, to have you, Stuart. So sorry that it always has to come to a close too fast, because there's clearly so much more that you have to share and so much more that the community wants to learn. But for now, this has been an incredibly synergistic event for all of us. It's been a true honor to welcome you back to Berkeley, albeit virtually. We look forward to doing so in person in the future. Deep, deep debt of gratitude to you. And I hope all of us can help thank Shirin Neshat, Pamela Kramlich, and Stuart Comer for everything that they do and everything they did today to make Thursday really special.
This was very special. I really appreciate your whole team. Thank you, Shannon and Stuart. This was very meaningful for me to engage with you and Pamela. And I hope one day soon we'll be in the same room together.
Mm-hmm.
Soon, please.
Okay.
Thank you all so much.
Amit Garam. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, bye.
Bye.